The morning sun didn't so much rise as it cut, casting harsh, unforgiving lines across the Whitmore household. Inside, Violet Green moved like a ghost, her hands trembling as she prepared a breakfast she wouldn't truly eat. She cracked the eggs, portioned them out for the children, and left the smallest, most pathetic piece for herself. It was a familiar ritual. The hollow ache in her gut had been her most faithful companion for months, a constant gnawing reminder of her place in this world. Little Sarah Whitmore, all sharp angles and ribs beneath a thin nightgown, tugged at Violet's frayed skirt. Her parents, bless their forgetful hearts, had left no money for food. Again. Violet's eyes darted to the door, a quick, furtive glance. Then, with a stealth born of long practice, she slid half of her own meager portion onto Sarah's plate. A small act of rebellion, a small act of survival. But the sound of heavy boots on the porch snapped her spine straight. The door flew open. Moses Green stood there, his presence sucking all the air from the room. His eyes, cold and hard as river stones, went straight to the plates. He saw the extra food on Sarah's plate. He saw the near-empty one in front of Violet. He didn't need to ask. He lunged, his fingers wrapping around Violet's wrist like a vice. The white marks his grip left on her dark skin were a brand. The children didn't scream. They didn't cry. They simply vanished, scattering to their rooms like mice fleeing a hawk. The walk to the general store was a parade of shame. Moses kept a heavy hand clamped on Violet's shoulder, steering her through the dusty main street of Dustwood territory. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Whispers died on the wind as they passed. Inside Patterson's general store, the smell of fresh baked bread was a special kind of torture. It made Violet's empty stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. Mrs. Patterson looked up from behind the counter, her polite smile tightening into a mask of thinly veiled disgust when she saw them. Moses pointed a thick finger at a small bag of flour and some dried beans. The bare minimum. Mrs. Patterson weighed the items with a deliberate, almost insulting slowness. Violet's gaze drifted to the glass jars of candy on the counter, bright spots of color in a gray world. She remembered her grandmother, years ago, slipping her peppermint sticks during the harvest. A memory from another life, a life where she wasn't starving. Mrs. Patterson set the items down. Moses reached for his coin purse, then froze. His eyes landed on Violet. She hadn't realized she was doing it, but her hand was resting on her hollow stomach, a gesture of pure, unconscious instinct. Moses's voice was a crack of thunder in the quiet store. "This is what happens when you're greedy," he boomed, his voice dripping with false righteousness. "You think you can steal food from the mouths of children?" Every head in the store snapped towards them. The weight of their stares felt like physical blows. Violet dropped her eyes to the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood, a desperate anchor in a sea of humiliation. The other customers started to murmur. Some nodded, their faces showing grim approval of Moses's public lesson. Others just stared, their eyes holding that morbid curiosity people save for roadside accidents and public hangings. Violet knew better than to protest. That only ever made it worse. So she stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind her back, her breathing even, while shame burned a hole in her chest. For a fleeting moment, Mrs. Patterson's expression softened, a flicker of something human in her eyes. But she didn't intervene. The rules of Dustwood were clear. A man's business with his wife was his own. Moses paid for the pitiful supplies and turned to leave. Violet followed 2 steps behind, her head bowed, the whispers growing louder as they walked toward the door. A shadow fell over them. A tall man stepped aside to let them pass, his frame filling the doorway, and then he followed them out. Violet didn't look up, but she felt his eyes on her. She heard the soft thud of his well-made boots on the wooden sidewalk. He moved with the quiet grace of a man who knew his way around danger. His clothes weren't fancy, but they were practical, built for hard work, not for show. Grayson Cade had seen the whole ugly scene. He'd been watching from the moment Moses opened his mouth. Something about the woman's quiet dignity, her refusal to break, had snagged his attention. Most people would have cried, or begged, or fought back. She had simply endured. Moses was tossing the supplies into their wagon, still lecturing her in a voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. A small crowd had gathered to enjoy the free entertainment. Violet climbed into the wagon, her movements slow and measured, conserving every last scrap of energy. Her eyes were shadowed pits and a face stretched too tight over bone. That's when Grayson stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with absolute clarity. "I could use a cook at my ranch," he said, looking directly at Moses. "I'll pay a fair wage, and I'll guarantee she's well fed." Moses stopped, his mouth hanging open. The offer hung in the dusty air, impossible to ignore. For the first time since she'd entered the store, Violet's head snapped up. Her eyes met Grayson's. Just for a second. In that second, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. It looked dangerously like respect. Hope was a poison. She couldn't afford it. Moses's face twisted into a dark scowl. His hand twitched toward the knife on his belt, but he stopped. Everyone knew Grayson Cade. He was fair, but he was also a man who finished what he started. The crowd held its breath. This was better than a public shaming. This was a challenge. Violet looked from Moses's snarling face to Grayson's calm, steady gaze. Her entire future was being decided right here, in the dirt street between these two men. Stay, and she would slowly starve, her spirit eroding with her body. Go, and she would be stepping into a complete unknown, with a man she didn't know, to a place of rumor and legend. People whispered about Cade Ranch. They said he was rich. They said he hired strange people, outcasts, people that no one else would touch. The stories were never quite good, but never quite bad either. Moses took a step toward Grayson, trying to puff out his chest. They were the same height, but Moses had the wiry, desperate energy of a scavenger, while Grayson stood with the solid, rooted strength of an old oak. He looked like a man who had never been hungry a day in his life, and in that tense, silent moment, Violet's stomach betrayed her. It let out a long, loud, agonizing growl. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet street. A few of the onlookers shuffled their feet, suddenly uncomfortably aware of the lunch they'd just eaten. That was it. That was the moment the decision was made. Slowly, her legs shaking from weakness and fear, Violet stood up in the wagon. She looked right at Grayson Cade. Her voice was just a whisper, but it carried the unshakable weight of a final vow. "I accept." Moses lunged for her, but it was too late. Grayson was already there, helping her down from the wagon, his hand firm and steady on her arm. The crowd, sensing the show was over, began to drift away. Some disappointed by the lack of a fistfight, others just relieved. As they walked toward Grayson's horse, Violet caught her reflection in the general store window. The woman staring back was a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. But behind the stranger's eyes, something new was beginning to flicker. It was a tiny flame, but for the first time in a very long time, it was there, and it was alive. The ride to Cade Ranch was long and silent. Grayson's horse moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, carrying them out of the dusty flatlands and into rolling hills crowned with ancient oaks. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Violet's body ached. Months of malnutrition had turned her muscles to water. She clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, as they climbed a steep, rocky incline. Just when she thought she couldn't hold on a moment longer, they crested a hill, and the ranch unfolded below them. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a place of desperation. It was alive. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys. People moved between the buildings, not with the shuffling gait of the defeated, but with purpose. Grayson swung down from the saddle and then reached up to help her. When her feet touched the ground, her legs gave out. She would have collapsed in the dust if he hadn't caught her. A hot flush of shame burned her cheeks, but Grayson acted like he hadn't noticed a thing. A woman came out of the main house. Her skin was a deep, rich brown, darker than Violet's own, and she moved with an air of absolute authority. A clean apron was tied over her sturdy work clothes, her hair braided in a neat crown. She looked Violet up and down, her eyes sharp, missing nothing. It was the look of a gatekeeper, someone who could size up a person's soul in a single glance. After a long moment, the woman's severe expression softened, just a little. She gave a slight nod. Grayson gestured towards the main house. As they walked, Violet started noticing things. Small details that didn't add up for a simple cattle ranch. The windows on the house had heavy wooden shutters, the kind that could be barred from the inside. In the corral, a half-dozen horses stood saddled and ready, as if for a sudden departure. The inside of the house shattered all her assumptions. The main room was enormous, bigger than the church back in Dustwood. Long trestle tables lined the walls, set for more people than any one family could ever need. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, with several women working together, preparing what looked like enough food to feed an army. A little boy ran past them, laughing as he chased a wooden horse. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that Violet hadn't heard in years. Then she saw the other children. Dozens of them, it seemed, from toddlers to teenagers. And their faces. They were a tapestry of humanity. Black, white, native, Mexican. A mix that would have caused a full-blown scandal back in town. Grayson led her to a quiet corner. "Sit," he said gently. Her mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then he told her. He spoke in a low, even voice, but his words carried the undeniable ring of truth. This wasn't a cattle ranch. It was a lie. A necessary, life-saving lie. It was a way station, a sanctuary. Families came here, he explained, fleeing from something. They stayed for a few days, sometimes a few weeks. They rested, they ate, they were given supplies and guidance. And then they continued their journey, north, towards a freedom they could only whisper about. The ranch was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Violet's hands started to shake. Not from hunger this time, but from the sheer, terrifying, magnificent scale of it all. The stories she had heard as a child, the whispered legends of secret routes and safe houses, they were real. And she was standing in the heart of one. The woman who had met them at the door, whose name was Martha, came over with a bowl of stew. The rich, savory smell hit Violet like a physical blow. Her stomach seized up so violently she had to sit down. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen a bowl of food that was all hers. The first spoonful was heaven. It was simple food, beef, potatoes, carrots, but it tasted of abundance, of safety. She forced herself to eat slowly, carefully, her shrunken stomach protesting even this small kindness. As she ate, Grayson explained more. The whole operation was a razor's edge. Timing was everything. One mistake, one loose tongue, and it wouldn't just be the current families who were doomed. It would be everyone they had ever helped. Trust was the only coin that had any value here, and it had to be earned. The real secret, he told her, was in the barn. He led her there after she finished her meal. From the outside, it was just a barn. But inside, it was a hidden village. Families were huddled together on clean straw pallets, their few belongings bundled beside them. The air was thick with the smell of hay and fear and a fragile, flickering hope. A man with a face like a worn leather map approached Grayson, speaking in low tones, gesturing to a chart spread out on a barrelhead. Violet moved closer, catching snippets of their conversation. Patrol schedules, weather fronts, sympathetic farmhouses, safe water sources. And as she listened, a strange sense of familiarity washed over her. The logistics of it all, it reminded her of something. Back on the plantation, in the darkest years, she had been the one who helped coordinate the meager food distribution. It had been a massive operation, keeping hundreds of people alive on scraps. Her memory was a peculiar gift. She never forgot a face, a name, a date, a route. It was a skill she had learned to survive, a tool her masters had used to keep track of their property. She had always hated that part of herself, the part that was so good at organizing for her own oppressors. But here, in this barn full of desperate souls, she saw it. She saw how that same gift, that same cursed memory, could be used for something else entirely. Grayson was still deep in conversation with the man. Violet stepped up to the map. The routes were drawn in faint pencil, but she saw the gaps instantly, the dangerous stretches where they were exposed. Without thinking, she reached out a finger and pointed to a place on the map. "There," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through their hushed discussion. Both men turned and stared at her. "There's a creek bed," she explained, her voice gaining confidence. It runs parallel to the main road for 5 miles. There's cover from the trees and fresh water. I used to walk it when I worked for the Whitmores. The weathered man looked at the map, then back at her, his eyes wide. Grayson's expression was impossible to read. But something had changed. He wasn't looking at her like a victim he had rescued anymore. He was looking at her like an asset. That night, Violet lay in a soft bed, her stomach full, a warm blanket pulled up to her chin. But she couldn't sleep. Her mind was on fire, racing with possibilities she had never dared to dream. The starving, broken woman who had ridden out of Dustwood was already fading, being replaced by someone new. Someone she didn't recognize yet. But for the first time in a very long time, she was excited to meet her. In 3 weeks, Violet became a different person. The hollows in her cheeks filled out. The tremor in her hands vanished. But the biggest change was in her eyes. The haunted, hunted look was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intelligence that missed nothing. She had found her purpose. It wasn't just in the kitchen, though she ran it with an efficiency that amazed everyone. Her real purpose was in the quiet, deadly choreography of the escape network. Her idea for a coded meal system was born from that kitchen. It was simple, but brilliant. Cornbread with honey meant the route was clear, travel at dawn. Biscuits with no butter meant a patrol was spotted, lay low for a day. 2 apple slices meant take the western fork. 3 meant take the eastern. The food itself became the map. It was a language only the desperate could understand. Her photographic memory, once a source of shame, became their most powerful weapon. She knew the names, faces, and family stories of every soul who passed through. More than that, she memorized the entire network. Every safe house, every sympathetic contact, every dangerous patrol route from here to the Canadian border was filed away in her mind. Nothing was ever written down. It was all in Violet's head. The system was perfect. It worked without a single hitch for weeks. Until one Tuesday morning, when a rider came in with news that turned the blood in her veins to ice. The Morrison family had been caught. They'd left 4 days earlier. They should have been long gone, safe across the state line. But they'd been captured near a place called Willow Creek. Grayson's face became a mask of stone as he heard the news. The Morrisons had 3 small children, a baby. The thought of what would happen to them was unbearable. But the implications were even worse. Someone had talked. The location of the capture was too precise. The timing was too perfect. This wasn't bad luck. This was a betrayal. And just like that, every eye in the sanctuary turned to Violet. She was the new one, the outsider. Her arrival was the only thing that had changed. And the failed escape happened using her system. The easy warmth she had come to cherish on the ranch evaporated overnight. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. The smiles she received were suddenly tight and wary. Even the children who had adored her now watched her from a distance. She was a suspect. Grayson was torn. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the quiet connection that had been growing between them, the shared looks over the dinner table, the late-night talks by the fire. It was all poisoned by suspicion. He was the leader. His first duty was to the network, not to one woman. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in the middle of the room. Then it struck again. Another family, the Johnsons, was captured. They had followed a new route, one that only a handful of people knew about, a route that Violet had planned herself. The evidence was crushing. It all pointed to her. That night, Violet lay on her cot, staring into the darkness, the bitter irony choking her. For years, Moses had accused her of every sin imaginable, all of them lies. Now here, in this place of hope, she was facing real suspicion for a crime she didn't commit. The old feelings of isolation, of being the outcast, threatened to pull her under. But something was different this time. She wasn't that helpless woman anymore. She had a voice, she had skills, and she had an entire network of innocent lives to protect. This time she would fight back. The next morning, Violet started her own investigation. If there was a traitor, it had to be someone with access to the most sensitive information. Someone inside the inner circle. The list of people was terrifyingly small. She replayed the last month in her mind. Every conversation, every shared meal, every planning session. Her memory gave her a perfect, crystal clear playback. She saw who was in the room when the Morrison route was discussed. She saw who was looking over her shoulder when she planned the Johnson escape. A pattern began to emerge, but it made no sense. The one person present for every critical discussion was Grayson. It couldn't be him. She refused to believe it. But the facts were the facts. Despair began to creep in. Had she escaped one monster only to be taken in by another, more subtle one? Was this entire sanctuary just a more elaborate trap? The answer came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Little Sarah Whitmore. She showed up on a Thursday afternoon, her mother having brought her out from town for a visit. But Sarah didn't want to see her mother. She ran straight to Violet. The child was bubbling with excitement about a new game she was playing with her papa. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been asking her all about her visits to the ranch. He wanted to know all the fun stories, the names of the new people, the interesting things they were doing, the songs they sang. He told her it was their special secret adventure, and in that moment, the entire horrifying truth crashed down on Violet. It wasn't Grayson. It wasn't anyone on the ranch. The traitor was Thomas Whitmore, and he was using his own innocent daughter as a spy. Every kind word Violet had shared with the child, every biscuit she had given her, every time she had let Sarah help her in the kitchen while she prepared the coated meals. She had been unwittingly feeding intelligence directly to the enemy. The realization made her sick to her stomach. But right behind the sickness came a cold, hard resolve. Whitmore thought he was clever using a child. But a child's report could be a very unreliable thing. A child's report could be changed. That evening, Violet went to Grayson. She laid out the whole ugly story. The doubt in his eyes was replaced by a slow-burning fury, and then a dawning respect. He had suspected her, but she had been the one to solve the puzzle. Her plan was terrifyingly simple and terrifyingly risky. She would use the spy to feed the enemy false information. She would orchestrate the largest, most complex escape they had ever attempted, with 32 people waiting in the barn. And at the same time, she would lay a trap that would expose Whitmore and his allies for good. Just as they finalized the plan, another rider arrived. The news was bad. Moses had thrown in with the local lawman, Sheriff Reed. They were stirring up trouble in town, publicly questioning what was going on at Cade Ranch. The pressure was building. The walls were closing in. Her personal battle with Moses would have to wait. The fate of 32 souls rested on her shoulders. The margin for error was zero. That afternoon when Sarah arrived, Violet was ready. As the little girl chattered away, helping her stir a bowl of batter, Violet began to casually mention the big trip happening soon. She gave Sarah the wrong date, the wrong time, and the wrong routes. Detailed, believable routes that would lead any posse straight into a box canyon. Meanwhile, she and Grayson were secretly moving up the real departure by 2 full days. They would leave tomorrow, before dawn, in small groups, using brand new paths. The complexity was staggering. She was running 2 entirely separate operations in her head, one real, one fake. One slip of the tongue, one misplaced detail, and everyone would die. As night fell, Violet stood in the kitchen where her new life had begun. The scared, starving woman was a distant memory. In her place stood a strategist, a leader, a woman holding dozens of lives in the palm of her hand. The stakes were impossibly high. But looking out at the barn, where 32 people were praying for a miracle, Violet Green knew she was ready. Dawn was a smear of cold, gray light on the horizon as Violet's intricate plan clicked into motion. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night walking the entire operation through her mind, again and again, checking every route, every timing, every contingency until the whole thing was a flawless machine in her head. Today she would find out if she was a savior or a fool. The refugees began to move in the pre-dawn gloom. 6 groups, 6 different paths, their departures staggered by minutes that Violet had calculated based on the moon and the terrain. The families with the youngest children left first, their journey padded with extra time for rest. They melted into the landscape like ghosts. The ranch was quiet again by the time Sarah Whitmore arrived, skipping into the kitchen, a ray of innocent sunshine in a world of deadly secrets. She had no idea that her arrival was the final piece of the trap. Violet greeted her with a warm smile and a plate of fresh biscuits. her hands perfectly steady, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The disinformation was easy. As they baked together, Violet chatted about the big departure planned for the next evening. She laid out the fake routes in loving detail. Routes that would lead Sheriff Reed and his men on a wild goose chase through the roughest country in the territory. Sarah listened, her eyes wide, memorizing every word for her secret adventure with her papa. At the same time, Grayson and his most trusted hands were sanitizing the ranch. They worked with a desperate, focused energy. The hidden compartments in the barn were emptied, then filled with legitimate sacks of feed. The extra bedding vanished into a deep root cellar dug years ago for just this purpose. Every map, every note, every scrap of evidence was consumed by fire. By mid-morning, Cade Ranch was exactly what it appeared to be. A prosperous, well-run cattle operation. Nothing more. It would take more than a suspicious sheriff to find the truth now. The enemy arrived sooner than they'd expected. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced them long before they reached the gate. It was Moses, riding alongside Sheriff Reed and three grim-faced deputies. Violet watched from the kitchen window. This was it, the first test. Grayson met them at the gate. He wasn't tense or defensive. He was the picture of a confident landowner, slightly annoyed by the interruption, but perfectly willing to cooperate. He smiled, offered them a drink, and invited them to search wherever they liked. The frustration on Sheriff Reed's face grew with every passing minute. His men tore the place apart. They found nothing. The barn held only cattle and the smell of hay. The bunkhouse was just a bunkhouse. There was absolutely nothing out of place. Moses was practically vibrating with rage. He had promised the sheriff a nest of lawbreakers. He had staked his reputation on it, and the complete lack of evidence was making him look like a fool. That's when Violet made her move. She walked out of the main house carrying a tray laden with coffee and thick sandwiches. She offered it to the deputies first, her expression one of polite hospitality. The sight of her, healthy, confident, serving refreshments to the very men hunting her friends, seemed to break something in Moses. He stared at her, his mouth working silently. This was not the broken, starving creature he had dragged through the street. This was someone else, someone powerful. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting to find fugitives, but all they found was a well-run ranch and a woman who was clearly thriving. Just as the search was winding down, Thomas Whitmore rode up. He had come to witness his victory, to see the culmination of his clever little spy game. Instead, he found Sheriff Reed preparing to leave empty-handed, and his own daughter sitting in a warm kitchen, happily licking biscuit dough from her fingers. The silence was deafening. Then Sarah, seeing her father, piped up, "Papa, we're having a big adventure tomorrow night. Violet told me all about it." And she repeated, word for word, every detail of the false plan Violet had planted. Whitmore's face went from confusion to smug confidence. He thought the raid was just a day early. The real prize was still to come. The irony was so thick Violet could have cut it with a knife. The man who had betrayed dozens of families with his daughter's words was now being hopelessly deceived by them. As the posse prepared to ride out, defeated, Sheriff Reed made one last try. He turned to Violet, his eyes narrowed. He questioned her directly. Why did she leave her husband? What was her role here? His voice was laced with threats. Violet's answer was a masterpiece of truth and omission. She spoke of finding honest work, of the simple dignity of regular meals. She told no lies, yet revealed nothing. It was Moses who made the final, desperate play. He pointed a trembling finger at her and demanded she return home. He invoked the law, his rights as a husband. In this territory, that claim had weight. The crowd of ranch hands that had gathered tensed, waiting for the explosion. But Grayson didn't move toward Moses. He just stepped forward and held out a piece of paper. It was an employment contract. It detailed Violet's wages, her duties, and a specific clause protecting her from being forcibly returned to a place of abuse. And at the bottom, it was signed not just by Grayson, but by three of the most powerful and respected ranchers in the entire territory. It was a legal shield. It was ironclad. Moses was speechless. Sheriff Reed had no evidence, no charges, nothing. Their attack had been a complete and utter failure. As they rode away in a cloud of dust and humiliation, Whitmore lingered for a moment, giving his daughter a kiss. confirming the details of the ambush he was planning for the following night. Sarah, bless her innocent heart, confirmed everything perfectly. The ranch fell into a strange, quiet calm after they left. Out in the hills and valleys, 32 people were moving steadily toward freedom, while their enemies were about to chase ghosts into a dead-end canyon. Violet stood on the porch, watching the last of the dust settle. She was no longer the hunted. She had become the hunter. And tomorrow her trap would spring. Justice was coming to Dustwood, and it would be served cold. The trap didn't just spring, it snapped shut with the force of a bear trap. At dawn, Sheriff Reed, Thomas Whitmore, and a posse of their most trusted men were huddled in a rocky canyon, waiting. They waited all day. They watched empty trails as the sun beat down on them. They listened to the wind whistle through the rocks. 32 refugees, the people they were hunting, were at that very moment crossing safely into the next territory, miles and miles to the north. News of the colossal failure reached Dustwood by noon. In a small town, that kind of story travels faster than a prairie fire. First it was a rumor, then it was a joke. Sheriff Reed, the great lawman, had been sent on a fool's errand. He'd mobilized his entire force based on a tip that was completely, laughably wrong. Thomas Whitmore's carefully constructed reputation as a respectable town father shattered like cheap glass. People started asking questions. How could his information have been so bad? Was he a liar or just an idiot? The whispers turned venomous. Families who had entrusted their children to him began quietly pulling them from his tutelage. The man was a fool, and his judgment couldn't be trusted. Then came the real trouble. The territorial capital got wind of the botched raid. Federal marshals rode into town, not to hunt fugitives, but to investigate the local law. They started looking at Sheriff Reed's books. They found evidence of illegal bounty payments. They found records of arrests that didn't add up. A dark picture of corruption began to emerge, and Reed was at the center of it. Moses Green found himself utterly alone. His powerful allies were disgraced. The righteous crusade he thought he was leading had turned into a public farce, and now the town started looking at him differently. They had seen Violet at the ranch, healthy and strong. They remembered the skeletal, silent woman he used to parade through the street. The contrast was stark and damning. The story was no longer about a man disciplining his wife. It was about a cruel bully who had been left behind by his victim. 3 days later, Violet rode back into town. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid. She held her head high, her back straight. She was no longer Moses's burden. She was her own woman. The transformation was so profound that some people didn't even recognize her. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson, who had once watched her starve in silence, greeted her with a nervous, deferential respect. She paid for her goods, and the transaction was just that, a transaction. There was no shame, no commentary. It was just business. She knew the confrontation with Moses was coming. She found him waiting for her outside the bank, a pathetic figure slouched against the wall. He had been so sure she would come crawling back, but seeing her now so full of life seemed to have broken him. He looked like he was the one who was starving now. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, desperate emptiness. He had discovered that a tyrant with no one to terrorize is just a lonely, bitter man. He tried to demand she come home. He tried to bluster and threaten, but the words were empty. They had no power over her anymore. Violet looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of distant pity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply told him the truth. That life is over, Moses. I am not yours anymore. He started to sputter about the law, about a wife's duty, but his words died in his throat. The townspeople who had stopped to watch weren't on his side anymore. They saw the man who had withered and the woman who had bloomed. The moral of the story was written on their very faces. She hadn't needed to destroy him with revenge. She had destroyed him with her own success. Grayson rode into town just as Moses was making his last, pathetic appeal. His arrival was the final nail in the coffin. He didn't say a word. He just dismounted and stood beside Violet, a silent, unshakable wall of support. Moses looked from one to the other, and he knew it was over. He had no allies, no authority, no power. He was nothing. The partnership between Violet and Grayson was no secret. It had grown organically out of shared risk and mutual respect. Their announcement that they were to be married surprised absolutely no one. It just made official what everyone in Dustwood already knew. 6 months to the day after she had left him, Violet Green stood before the Dustwood Territory Council. Grayson was at her side. She was not there to ask for permission. She was there to inform them of a new reality. Their sanctuary, their underground railroad, was no longer a secret. It was becoming a legitimate refugee assistance program, and they were seeking the town's official support. The vote was unanimous. Several council members sheepishly admitted they had known something was going on at the Cade Ranch for years, but had chosen to look the other way. They had seen the new families settling in the area, starting businesses, paying taxes. They had seen the prosperity these so-called fugitives brought with them. The work was good for Dustwood. The final pieces of the old world fell away. Thomas Whitmore was utterly ruined when his own children, now safe in a loving home, testified about his secret adventure game. The community's outrage was absolute. He was gone within a week. Sheriff Reed was indicted on federal charges. His replacement was a by-the-book lawman from the Capitol with direct orders to cooperate with the new refugee program. Moses tried one last time. He stood up in church and gave a public apology. He confessed his sins. He begged for forgiveness, but it was too late. His words were hollow. The town had moved on. They didn't hate him anymore. They just didn't care. Violet's final victory wasn't a confrontation, it was a construction. She bought the old abandoned boarding house in the center of town. With Grayson's help, she renovated it. It became a welcome center, a place for new arrivals to stay while they got on their feet. Her coded meal system, once a tool of secret communication, became a way to signal to the community what a new family needed. A blue plate in the window meant they needed blankets. A red one meant they needed work. The woman who was once denied food now ran the place that ensured no one in her community ever went hungry. The boarding house opened with a huge celebration. People came from all over the territory. Even some of her old tormentors showed up, their curiosity stronger than their pride. They found a woman who greeted them with grace, offering them a plate of food without a hint of reproach. As the sun set, Violet stood on the porch, looking out at the crowded street. Every face was smiling, every belly was full. She had not just escaped her dark past. She had transformed it into a beacon of hope for hundreds of others. Her greatest suffering had become her greatest strength, and this was only the beginning. 1 year later, the Dustwood Autumn Harvest Festival was a scene of such vibrant life, it was hard to remember the sullen, suspicious town it had once been. The streets were lined with golden shocks of corn, and the air was rich with the smells of roasting meat and baking pies. At the very center of it all stood Violet. She moved through the controlled chaos of the community feast with the calm authority of a general, directing the flow of food and people with the same sharp-witted precision she had once used to guide refugees through the dark. Her boarding house, now named the Sanctuary, had become the beating heart of the town. All community life flowed through its doors. The morning was a joyful blur of activity. Families who had arrived a year ago as terrified, penniless fugitives now worked alongside the town's oldest residents, their children playing together in the street. The Henderson family, who had escaped a brutal landowner with nothing but the clothes on their backs, now owned the town's blacksmith shop. Their son, a boy who had arrived gaunt with hunger, was now a strapping teenager hauling tables for the feast. A woman named Maria Santos, who had fled north with 3 small children after her husband was killed, emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming pot of stew. She was the head chef at the sanctuary now, her cooking legendary throughout the territory. The whole economy of the region had been reborn. New farms, new shops, new life. The town was no longer a dead-end place people were stuck in. It was a destination, a place of opportunity. Grayson stood nearby, a constant, quiet presence at her side. The solitary rancher who had once hidden his good works behind a wall of privacy was now an open and beloved public figure. Their marriage had been the event of the season. Violet wanted a small, simple ceremony, but the community would not have it. Families they had helped came from 3 territories away. The crowd was so large it filled the church, the street, and the town square. Their refugee program, once a dangerous secret, was now a federally funded and legally protected organization. The Underground Railroad hadn't just survived, it had come out into the light. Children's laughter was the soundtrack to the day. Among them were the Whitmore children. After their father's disgrace, they had been taken in by the Hendersons. Sarah, the unwitting spy, was now a bright, confident young girl, cherished and protected. She ran to Violet and threw her arms around her legs, and Violet lifted her up, her heart full. The afternoon train brought the last of the guests. Dignitaries from the territorial capital stepped onto the platform, greeted by the mayor. And among the passengers, a single figure stood apart, hesitant and alone. It was Moses Green. The sight of him sent a jolt through Violet. He was a ghost from a past life. He was thin, so much thinner than she had ever been. His body stooped, his eyes hollowed out by a hunger of the soul. His clothes were clean but threadbare. He moved like a man who expected a blow at any moment. She saw him before he saw her. The old fear, the memory of pain and humiliation, was a cold whisper in the back of her mind. But it was only a whisper. The rest of her was filled with a strength that left no room for fear. He saw her and stopped. He seemed to shrink, overwhelmed by the sight of her. She was not just surviving, she was reigning, surrounded by a community that loved her, the undisputed matriarch of this new world she had built. He approached slowly, his hat clutched in his hands. He looked at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. When he finally looked up, his voice was a dry rasp. He apologized. His apology wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, broken, and shockingly sincere. He spoke of the black, bitter emptiness that had eaten him alive after she left, how his cruelty, with no one to consume, had turned inward and consumed him instead. He asked for nothing. He made no excuses. Violet listened. She looked at this broken man, this shell of her former tormentor, and felt a profound sense of peace. The rage was gone. The hatred was gone. There was only a quiet finality. Her response was for the entire community to hear. She acknowledged his apology, but she did not absolve him. "Your path back is your own to walk, Moses," she said, her voice clear and strong, "just as mine was." But then she did something no one expected. "But you look hungry," she said. "Come, there is plenty to eat." She offered him a plate. It was not forgiveness. It was grace. It was a demonstration of the principle upon which she had rebuilt her life in this town. No one goes hungry here. No one. The feast began as the sun dipped below the hills. Long tables stretched down Main Street, groaning with food. Everyone had a place, from the territorial governor to Moses Green. Violet stood and raised a glass. She didn't give a long speech. She just spoke from the heart about the power of a community to heal and the simple, sacred duty to feed the hungry and shelter the lost. Later that evening, she saw Moses sitting with the Henderson family. They were talking to him, sharing their own story. They were showing him the same grace she had. His journey would be long, but for the first time, it was not impossible. The festival wound down late into the night. As the last of the music faded and the sleeping children were carried home, Violet walked alone through the quiet streets. The remnants of the feast were everywhere. The promise Grayson had made to her in this very street, what felt like a lifetime ago, echoed in her mind. "You'll never go hungry." He had been right, but the promise had become so much bigger. She had created a world where that promise was true for everyone. The woman who had been starved had become the bread of life for an entire community. Her victory was not in the destruction of her enemy, but in the creation of something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of her pain. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of one person to change the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption.